When I called my daughter about the holiday dinner, her husband laughed and said, "It ended an hour ago. You weren't invited." I stayed silent. 3 days later, he received a text. "You're bankrupt." His knees buckled. This was only the beginning. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is in your region right now. The phone rang at 7:43 in the evening, and I almost didn't pick up. I'd been in the garage for most of the afternoon, running a hand plane along a piece of white oak I'd been shaping into a chair leg. Sawdust on my jeans, coffee gone cold on the workbench. Outside, the street was quiet the way Charleston gets quiet on Thanksgiving. Everyone tucked inside somewhere warm, the smell of something roasting drifting through someone's cracked window. Just not mine. I'm Raymond Foster, 67 years old, retired CPA, resident of 2814 Magnolia Creek Drive, apparently a man who spends major holidays alone in his garage. Context matters in accounting and in life, so there it is. The call was from my daughter Christina. That's what the screen said, anyway. Christina Cool, née Foster, 39 years old, my only child, married 9 years to a man named Stephen Cool, who owns 2 restaurants here in Charleston and considers himself something of a visionary. The phone rang. I wiped my hands on a rag and answered, "Hey, sweetheart." "Yeah, it's Stephen." I recognized the voice immediately. That particular brand of casual that isn't casual at all. The kind that's been practiced in front of a mirror. Stephen Cool, 38, tailored blazer even on a Tuesday, handshake like he's applying for a loan. Charming in public, something else entirely in private. I'd watched him work a room at his restaurant, Harbor Table, on East Bay Street. Watched him turn on that smile like flicking a light switch. I also knew what his face looked like when no one important was watching. "Stephen," I said. "Is Christina—" "She's busy." A pause. Then, almost as an afterthought, "Dinner already ended, by the way, about an hour ago, just so you know." I waited. "Nobody invited you," he added. There was a sound behind him. The clink of glasses, someone laughing at something, the comfortable noise of a full table. "I figured you'd call eventually, so now you know." I stood there in my garage, hand still holding the phone, looking at the half-finished chair leg on the workbench. In the background I could hear my daughter's voice. Not her words, just the sound of her. She said nothing directed at the phone, nothing directed at me. "Okay," I said. "Okay," he repeated, and I could hear the smile in it. I hung up. Here is what I did not do. I did not call back. I did not drive to their house on Ravenel Lane. I did not sit down and write a long, wounded text message about family and respect and everything I'd done for the 2 of them over the years. Here is what I did do. I put the phone face down on the workbench, picked up the hand plane, and kept working. I finished the chair leg. I swept the floor. I went inside, reheated some leftover soup, and sat at the kitchen table without turning on the television. In that line of work, you learn that the first thing you feel when something goes wrong is rarely the most useful thing. The most useful thing comes later, after the noise dies down. So I sat there and I started asking questions. Not about why Stephen Cool had answered his wife's phone. I already had a theory about that. The question was different, the kind I used to ask at the start of a financial audit. What am I actually looking at here, and how far does it go? Because the thing about Stephen Cool, the thing that had been sitting at the back of my mind for 3 years like a pebble in a shoe, was that his business existed in no small part because of me. 3 years ago, he'd come to me with a proposal, not a request. He never made requests. Stephen made proposals, as if he were doing you a favor by letting you participate. He wanted to expand Harbor Table, maybe open a second location. The bank, Palmetto, First Bank on Meeting Street, had agreed to a commercial loan of $340,000, but they needed a guarantor, someone with financial standing who would co-sign and be on the hook if the payment stopped. "It's just a formality," Stephen told me, sitting across from me at my kitchen table with that practiced smile. I wouldn't even ask, but you know how banks are. They want a belt and suspenders. Christina had looked at me from the couch with the expression she'd been wearing a lot back then, half apologetic, half hopeful. Like she was asking me to do this not because it was a good idea, but because it would keep the peace. I signed the guarantee agreement, $340,000. My name on a line that said, essentially, if this man doesn't pay, you come to me. That was 3 years ago. Since then, I'd received exactly one text message from Stephen that could be construed as gratitude. It read, "Lawyer says paperwork is good. Thanks." He hadn't included my name. I thought about that as I sat at the kitchen table. Then I got up, went to the filing cabinet in the second bedroom, the one I use as an office, and pulled out the folder labeled Cologne 2022. I hadn't opened it since I'd filed it away. I opened it now. The first 2 pages were what I expected. The guarantee agreement, my signature at the bottom, the loan terms, the palmetto, first letterhead. I read them slowly, the way you read a contract when you actually mean it. The interest rate, the repayment schedule, the collateral. And then I got to page 4. There was a document I didn't recognize. A loan modification agreement dated 14 months after the original signing. It referred to a change in the collateral structure, specifically the substitution of the original secured asset with a different property. The modification was signed by Stephen Cool and a Palmetto First Loan officer. My signature was nowhere on it. I sat with that for a moment. In South Carolina, a material change to the terms of a guaranteed loan without the written consent of the guarantor is not a minor procedural matter. It is, depending on how the original agreement is written, potentially grounds for challenging the entire guarantee. I set the document down on the desk. I looked at the clock. It was nearly 11 at night on Thanksgiving. I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder what else is in here. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was upset. I've found in my later years that genuine anger is actually quite clarifying, like cold water. But because my mind kept running columns, the way it does when there's a discrepancy in the numbers and you know the answer is in there somewhere. You just haven't found the right line yet. By the time pale gray light started coming through the bedroom window, I had made 2 decisions. The first was that I was going to need a lawyer. The second was that I was going to need someone who could find things that weren't meant to be found. But let me back up for a moment, because you should understand how we got here. There was a time when Thanksgiving at Christina's meant something. 5 years ago, before the second restaurant, and before Stephen started wearing his success like armor. Christina had cooked a turkey overdone on one side, Stephen made a sweet potato dish from his mother's recipe, and was genuinely proud of it. We talked past midnight at their apartment off Rutledge Avenue. Christina laughed the way she used to. Too loud, head back. Stephen asked about an audit case I was finishing, actually listened, asked to follow up. We disagreed about something, and he said with what seemed like real warmth, "Raymond, you are completely wrong about this, and I respect you for it." I drove home thinking he might be all right after all. Looking back, he was in the middle of arranging the financing for the second location. He needed me to like him. I did. He got what he needed. The warmth had a shelf life. The changes in Christina were slower. That's the part that's harder to explain and harder to sit with. My daughter was not a passive person. She graduated top of her program at the College of Charleston, ran financial operations for a regional nonprofit for 4 years, then married Stephen, and gradually became the person who managed his life instead. It didn't happen dramatically. It happened the way water shapes stone. The clearest moment I can point to. 2 years into the marriage, a dinner party at Harbor Table. Stephen was holding court at one end of the table, making a claim about his expansion projections that was, charitably, disconnected from the actual numbers. I started to say something. Christina caught my eye across the table. The look wasn't, "Please don't embarrass me." It was quieter than that. It was, "This is how things are now." I ate my dinner and drove home and filed that away. The next morning I drove to King Street, 4th floor, Price & Associates, corporate and contract law. The name had come from the South Carolina Bar Referral Directory, which is where you start when you don't want someone who already knows your son-in-law. Daniel Price was 44, reading glasses pushed up on his head, desk of a man who thought in systems. He listened to everything without interrupting. The guarantee, the unsigned modification, the Thanksgiving call. When I finished, he was quiet. "Paragraph 11, sub B," he said. "That's the clause?" Any modification to the underlying loan terms requires written acknowledgement from all parties to the guarantee. If that requirement isn't met, the modification is voidable at the guarantor's election. He took off his glasses and set them on the desk. Mr. Foster, you may have a fairly strong position here. I know, I said. I want to know what else he did. Price took the case. Before I left, he wrote a name on a notepad. Marshall Crawford, 1740, Sam Rittenberg Boulevard, Suite 9, former insurance investigator. I drove over that afternoon. Crawford was 51, with the kind of stillness that comes from a career in insurance investigation. A man who had spent years finding money that other people believed they'd hidden. He didn't ask many questions. He took the basic information, quoted me a retainer of $3,200, and said he'd start the following day. 4 days later, he had a folder on his desk. SC Meridian Holdings, he said, tapping a page. Single member LLC, registered 18 months ago. Standard anonymization setup. Law firm as registered agent. But the actual owner, based on property transfer records and state filings, is your son-in-law. A warehouse in North Charleston, roughly 8,400 square feet, purchased quietly, held under the LLC, no visible connection to either restaurant. Estimated market value, $185,000. His wife aware of this? I asked. Nothing in any joint financial documents suggests it, Crawford said. I sat with that for a moment. A man whose restaurant operation required a $340,000 guaranteed loan had a hidden property worth nearly $200,000 that his wife didn't know existed. That kind of separation doesn't happen carelessly. That kind of separation happens when someone is already thinking about a future in which they need assets no one else can reach. I drove home and started a new file. I labeled it Cool, Full Picture. 2 days passed. I let them pass. I read the document slowly, the way I used to read a balance sheet when something didn't add up. Not looking for anything specific, just letting the shape of the thing come clear. Crawford called on the third day. His voice was the same as always, but there was something underneath it. I have a photograph, he said. You should see it. He'd been outside Palmetto First Bank that afternoon. The image showed Stephen coming down the front steps beside a man Crawford had already identified, a commercial real estate broker, 3 warehouse closings in North Charleston in the past 2 years. They had the ease of people finishing something. Stephen was holding a document folder. The date on the image was 2 days after Thanksgiving. He was trying to sell the warehouse, moving fast, which meant he either knew something had shifted or sensed it was about to. I set the photograph down and called Daniel Price. It was 11:14 at night. I need you to block a sale, I said. Tomorrow morning. He asked for the address. A pause, then, I can file a LIS pendens. We move first thing before any deed transfer records. Another pause. Mr. Foster, once we do this, he'll know it came from you. 48 hours, maybe less. I looked out the truck window at the dark street. That's fine, I said. Let him. I drove home, parked in the garage, and stood for a moment in the quiet with the smell of sawdust and machine oil. Somewhere under a workbench was an unfinished oak chair, 2 legs still rough, waiting on the plane. 48 hours. I had time. Price called me at 8:15 the following morning. I was already in the garage, coffee in hand, looking at the list pendants filing he'd sent to my email at midnight. It's on record, he said. Charleston County Register of Deeds. As of this morning, no transfer of the North Charleston property can be recorded without the court's sign-off. And the broker? He'll find out when he pulls title. Could be today, could be tomorrow. Either way, the sale is dead until we say otherwise. A pause. Mr. Foster, I want to be clear. This is a holding action. We've stopped one move. But if Stephen Cole has an attorney with any competence, they'll figure out the blocking party within 48 hours and respond accordingly. I understand, I said. That's fine. What I didn't tell Price, because it wasn't relevant to his work, was that I was counting on exactly that. A man who panics is a man who makes mistakes. I've watched it in audit rooms. You bring someone face to face with a discrepancy in their numbers, and the smart ones go quiet and call their lawyers. The ones who overestimate themselves start explaining. Stephen Cool, in my experience, was the explaining type. But before the panic, I had one more thing to do. I drove to the offices of Hargrove and Bell on Broad Street that same afternoon. They specialize in estate planning and trust formation. I'd used their predecessor firm once, a decade ago, for a client referral, and knew their work was clean. The attorney who saw me was a woman named Diane Hargrove, senior partner, 50-something, with the unhurried manner of someone who has drafted enough documents to know that careful is faster than fast. I explained what I needed, a revocable living trust. The assets I wanted moved into it were my house at 2814 Magnolia Creek Drive, currently appraised at approximately $310,000, and my investment account at Coastal Heritage Bank. Balance at that point just over $214,000. Any specific reason for the urgency? She asked. I'm involved in a dispute with a party who may eventually make financial claims against me. I want my personal assets properly structured before that escalates. She nodded, not the nod of someone surprised, the nod of someone who has heard this sentence many times in many different forms. A revocable living trust won't protect assets from existing creditors, she said, but for future claims, and for probate purposes, it's solid. I'm aware, I said. That's why I'm here now, not next month. The Raymond J. Foster Living Trust was filed with the appropriate paperwork within the week. My house and my investment account now sat inside a legal structure that I controlled entirely as trustee, and that no speculative lawsuit from an overconfident son-in-law could simply reach into. I drove home and felt, for the first time since Thanksgiving, something that wasn't anger. It was closer to the feeling I used to get at the end of a long audit, when the numbers finally balanced. A kind of quiet satisfaction that has nothing to do with excitement, and everything to do with things being correct. Crawford had not been idle. 2 evenings after the trust filing, he came by with a manila folder. We sat at the kitchen table. The broker in the Palmetto First Bank photograph, the man Stephen had been walking with, turned out to be Greg Whitmore, commercial real estate, 4 warehouse transactions in the Charleston area over the past 18 months. Crawford had pulled county property filings. The North Charleston property was priced at $185,000 in the draft sale agreement, Crawford said. I obtained that through legitimate channels, a contact at the county recorder's office. Stephen had been trying to move the hidden asset before his credit situation became public. He'd known the guarantee was vulnerable and had been preparing an exit. Smart, in principle. If the sale had closed before my lice pendens filing, that $185,000 would have been unreachable. He'd been 2 or 3 days ahead of where I thought he was. 2 or 3 days was exactly what he didn't have. I set the page down and picked up my coffee. One more thing, Crawford said. He pulled out a second sheet. I ran the full chain of title on the North Charleston warehouse. When Stephen purchased it through SC Meridian Holdings, he used a short-term bridge loan to close. That loan, $112,000, 18 months, from a private lender, comes due in approximately 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The warehouse sale was how he was planning to pay off the bridge loan. Without the sale, he had a $112,000 balloon payment coming due with no visible source of funds. The picture was getting cleaner by the day. A man with 2 restaurants carrying combined debt north of $500,000, a hidden property he couldn't sell, a bridge loan about to mature, and a guaranteed credit line that was now under review. Every piece of it had been running on the assumption that nothing would change, that the old man with the signed guarantee would keep sitting quietly in his garage on Magnolia Creek Drive, planing chair legs and staying out of the way. I looked at Crawford across the kitchen table. Is there anything else in that folder? He almost smiled. That's the folder, he said, but I'd say that's enough. After he left, I stood at the kitchen window for a while. Outside, the yard was going brown at the edges. Late autumn in Charleston, the kind of cold that doesn't commit. I thought about the phone call on Thanksgiving, the clink of glasses behind Stephen's voice, the sound of my daughter not saying anything. I thought, 48 hours. Price had said Stephen would figure out the blocking party within 48 hours. That was fine. I had everything I needed. The next move wasn't mine to make. It was his. I went back to the garage and started work on the second chair leg. The 48 hours passed like a held breath. I finished the chair leg. I sanded the joints on the first one, checking the fit twice. I drove to a hardware store on Savannah Highway and picked up a new set of chisels I'd been putting off buying. Normal things. The kind of day that looks, from the outside, like nothing is happening. I knew Stephen had found out about the LIS pendants by the end of the first day. Crawford had a contact at the county recorder's office, as I mentioned, and the contact mentioned that a query had come in from a Charleston attorney named Brett Holloway, who, according to the South Carolina Bar Directory, specialized in commercial real estate disputes. Stephen had moved fast, I'll give him that. The second day, nothing from Price, nothing from Crawford. I made a pot of soup, read a book about the construction of the Biltmore estate, wood joinery mostly, and went to bed at 10. On the third day, I sent the text message. It was a Sunday morning. I was at the kitchen table with the second cup of coffee. The house was quiet. I picked up the phone, opened a new message to Stephen Cole, typed 3 words, and pressed send. You're going broke. Then I put the phone face down on the table and poured a third cup. I want to be honest about what I was doing. I wasn't sending that message because I thought it would hurt him. I was sending it because I wanted to watch what he did next, and because a man like Stephen Cole, when he receives something he can't immediately explain, cannot help but respond. He has to establish that he's in control. It's structural, like a reflex. The phone stayed quiet for 40 minutes. Then it rang. Not a text, a call. He'd decided that a call communicated more authority. Sounded like something he'd have read in a business advice column. I let it go to 3 rings, then answered. Morning, Stephen. What is that supposed to mean? His voice was controlled, the surface tension of a man working very hard not to shout. What exactly are you trying to communicate? I'm not trying to communicate anything, I said. I just thought you should know where things stand. Things stand. He stopped. Reset. When he came back, his voice had dropped into the register he uses when he thinks he's being authoritative. Raymond, whatever you think you're doing with the Palmetto First account, you need to stop. That guarantee is legally binding. You don't just get to walk away from it. I let that sit for a moment. I'm not walking away from anything, I said. I'm exercising rights that were built into the contract you signed, which incidentally you modified without telling me. That's not me walking away. That's you changing the terms. That was a routine loan modification, without my written consent, as required by paragraph 11, sub B of the guarantee agreement. I know, because I read the paragraph. Did you? Silence. Stephen, I said, I'm not angry with you. I want you to understand that. I'm simply done holding a structure in place that you've been undermining for 3 years. That's all this is. You're going to cost me everything. His voice had changed again, still controlled, but something underneath it now. Something that was working not to sound like what it was. I didn't build the structure you're in, I said. I just stopped propping it up. I hung up. He called Price's office the following morning. Price relayed it that afternoon. A formal demand from Brett Holloway, Stephen's attorney. Withdraw the guarantee revocation and restore active status, or face a tortious interference claim seeking $418,000 in damages. I sat in Price's office and looked at the number. That's not how tortious interference works, I said. No, Price agreed. But it's not a random number either. It's a projected losses calculation from the loan freeze. Aggressive, but not incoherent. Holloway is competent. He won't win this. The paragraph 11B violation is real and your position is solid. But litigation takes time and money, and he knows that. I understand pressure tactics. I assumed you did? Price leaned back. My recommendation, we counter-notice Holloway citing the modification violation and simultaneously file a formal document request with Palmetto First for the unauthorized modification paperwork. On record, officially. Banks dislike contested guarantee situations. It makes their legal team look more carefully at the borrower. Do it, I said. On the drive home, I stopped at a nursery on James Island and bought a winterberry holly. I planted it that afternoon in the southeast corner of the yard, where it would get enough light. The ground was soft. It took about an hour. Crawford checked in the following evening. The North Charleston Bridge loan, $112,000 due in 6 weeks, had been flagged by the private lender's servicing firm after they received the LIS pendants filing in a routine title check. They wanted to know Stephen's plan for the balloon payment. He didn't have one. Crawford's financial picture was clear enough. The two restaurants were running a deficit against their debt service, and the joint investment account he and Christina held, which I knew existed because I'd co-signed their original lease application 9 years ago, carried a balance of roughly $31,000. Not nothing. Not a bridge loan payoff. I sat with all of this on the back porch, watching the light leave the yard. The winterberry holly had already started to settle, the way plants do after the first watering, going from provisional to planted. 3 years ago, I had signed my name to a document and handed a man a foundation he didn't build and couldn't maintain. I had done it because my daughter asked me, quietly, to keep the peace. And I had kept it while Stephen Cool built something leveraged and hidden, entirely dependent on my continued silence. It was a solid plan. It had one flaw. I read contracts. I went inside. Price had already sent an email confirmation. Trust filing complete. Counter notice to Holloway sent by certified mail that afternoon. The counter notice cited paragraph 11B, the unauthorized modification, and our position that the guarantee became voidable at that point. Stephen was going to receive that envelope in a day or two and find a clause he'd never read in a contract he'd signed without understanding. Something in the back of his very capable, very overconfident mind was going to shift. I went to bed at 10:30 and slept without difficulty for the first time in a week. She showed up on a Monday morning, a little before 9. I was in the kitchen when I heard the car in the driveway. Christina's gray Volvo, the one Stephen had picked out because it photographed well. I watched through the window as she sat in it for almost a full minute before getting out. She was wearing a coat I didn't recognize. Her hair was up. She walked to the front door the way a person walks when they've rehearsed the walk. I opened the door before she could knock. She looked at me. I looked at her. Whatever speech she'd prepared on the drive over seemed to reorganize itself. What came out first was, "Stephen told me what you did." "Come in," I said. "It's cold." She came in. I made coffee without asking. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed. Not hostile exactly, but braced, like she was expecting to need the posture. "He said you filed something with the bank," she said, "that you're trying to destroy his business." "I filed a notice of revocation," I said. "It's a legal instrument. It says that if the loan terms change without my written consent, I'm no longer obligated under the guarantee, which is what paragraph 11, sub B of the original agreement has always said. You know what happens if that loan gets called? We lose everything." "Sit down, Christina." She didn't for a moment. Then she did. I went to the office and came back with a manila folder. I set it on the kitchen table and opened it without saying anything. The first page, the original guarantee agreement with my signature. The second, the loan modification document, the one Stephen filed without telling me, changing the collateral structure. I'd circled the signature lines in pencil. No line for the guarantor. That document changed the terms of a loan I was legally responsible for, I said, without asking me. She looked at the page but didn't respond. Next, Crawford's report on SC Meridian Holdings, the LLC registration, the North Charleston warehouse, the bridge loan. "This is a property your husband owns," I said. "Warehouse in North Charleston held under a shell company. Purchased 18 months ago. You're not on the title." I paused. "Were you told about it?" Her eyes moved across the page. Something shifted in her face. Not shock so much as the look of someone who'd half suspected something for a long time and was now being shown the math. The last page, the summary of the $78,000 credit line obtained in my name without my knowledge. She read it twice. When she looked up, I asked the only question that mattered. "Did you know about any of this?" A long silence. "I knew the business had some debt," she said. "Stephen handles the finances." I repeated that sentence back to her quietly, not unkindly, just so it could be what it was. She stood up abruptly. "I need to talk to him." "That's your right," I said. "You can't just... Dad, you can't just blow up our lives because you're angry about a phone call." I looked at her. She was my daughter. She had her mother's eyes and her grandfather's stubbornness, and 9 years of carefully installed ideas about who I was and what I was worth. I kept my voice even. I'm not blowing up anything, Christina. I'm exercising rights that exist in a contract I signed. What I'm asking you to consider is why that contract was modified without telling me, and what else hasn't been told to you. She left without finishing her coffee. I heard the Volvo back out of the driveway. I sat at the kitchen table for a while, looking at the folder. The legal demand arrived by certified mail 4 days later. Stephen's attorney, Brett Holloway, had drafted it precisely. Raymond Foster was to restore the guaranteed active status within 10 business days, or face a civil action for tortious interference, seeking $418,000 in compensatory damages. I photographed the letter, emailed it to Price, and put the original in the filing cabinet under cool. Full picture. Then I went to the garage and picked up where I'd left on the second chair. It was while I was fitting the back slats, a finicky piece of work, each one cut to a slightly different angle, that I pulled Crawford's report out again. I'd been through it a dozen times, but there was a line I kept returning to. Not the warehouse, not the bridge loan, something I'd initially read past and then circled on the third read. 2 years ago, Stephen had transferred the title of Harbor Table, the East Bay Street restaurant, the flagship, the one that actually made money, into Christina's name alone. The Grove Grill, the suburban bistro that ran at a loss, stayed in his name. Harbor Table, valued at approximately $420,000 as a going concern, now legally belonged to my daughter. On the surface, this looks like generosity, a husband giving his wife an asset. I set down the back slat and thought about it from the other direction. If Stephen's finances collapsed, no longer a remote possibility, creditors could pursue his personal assets, but not automatically assets held solely in Christina's name, provided the transfer predated the problems by enough time. 2 years was a reasonable buffer. The Grove Grill, the loss-making location, stayed in his name. Harbor Table, the valuable one, went to Christina. He had used her as a firewall. She didn't know she was one. If Palmetto first called the full loan balance and Stephen's available collateral didn't cover it, the bank's attorneys would look very carefully at what had been transferred and when. Christina could end up in the middle of something she'd walked into without knowing the floor plan. I put the report down. The chair slat was still in my hand. I thought, I need to be more careful than I thought. Sandra Gordo, the independent CPA I'd hired through the South Carolina Association of CPAs directory, called 2 weeks after I'd engaged her. Her office was on Calhoun Street. She was 55, precise, with the careful phrasing of someone who said exactly what the document supported and nothing more. She walked me through the review page by page. Total outstanding debt across both restaurants, $612,000. That covered the Palmetto First balance, the $78,000 credit line, vendor accounts more than 60 days past due, and equipment leasing rolled over twice. Monthly revenue averaged over 8 months, approximately $74,000. Monthly costs, including debt service, payroll, and operations, approximately $89,000. The $15,000 monthly gap had been covered by drawing down the credit line and irregular transfers from a personal account that Gordo couldn't fully characterize without access to Stephen's personal statements. Then she came to the item I hadn't expected. The Grove Grill's books showed what she described, with professional understatement, as inconsistencies in revenue reporting between the point-of-sale system records and deposited amounts. Over 8 months, approximately $23,400 in cash receipts, appearing in the POS logs, but not in the bank deposits. What does that pattern typically indicate? I asked. It most commonly indicates, she said, folding her hands on the desk, that a portion of cash revenue is being diverted before deposit. I paid her invoice, $3,100, and drove home. The counterclaim arrived the following week. Holloway had filed in Charleston County Circuit Court, tortious interference, intentional economic harm, $500,000 in compensatory damages. Price called me that afternoon. Aggressive, he said, but listen to the other side first. Palmetto, First, produce the formal documentation. The unauthorized modification is now officially in evidence. The bank's own records confirm it was executed without your consent, in direct violation of paragraph 11B. Their legal team is not pleased with how this loan was managed. I'm told informally they've opened an internal review. Meaning Palmetto First is motivated to resolve this cleanly, which is not good for your son-in-law. I told him about the Gordo audit, about the $23,400 discrepancy. He was quiet. That's a separate matter, he said carefully. I won't advise you specifically on it, but if you were ever inclined to make a formal referral to the relevant authorities, the audit documentation would be a solid foundation. I'll keep that in mind, I said. 3 days after the counterclaim landed, Stephen Cool appeared at my front door. He'd come alone. No Holloway, no Christina. He was in a dark blazer, the good one he saves for what he considers important meetings. His hair was neat, but the face underneath all of it was doing something different from usual. The practiced ease was gone. What was left looked like a man who had been awake too many nights in a row and was working very hard not to show it. I opened the door and waited. Raymond, he said my name like it was a concession. I think we need to talk, like family. I looked at him for a moment. He still had the posture, shoulders square, chin level, but his jaw was doing something tight at the corners, and his hands, I noticed, were not quite still. Come in, I said. He sat at the kitchen table, the same chair Christina had sat in a week earlier, and began talking. The version he told was organized and reasonable. He'd been dealing with cash flow pressure. The modification had been a routine adjustment his loan officer had suggested. He hadn't thought it required additional signatures. Everything could be worked out if I simply withdrew the revocation notice and let the situation stabilize. I listened to all of it. When he finished, I said, Where's Christina? He stopped. What? If this is a family conversation, I said, Where is she? He didn't answer that. What he did instead was shift registers. The reasonableness dropped, and underneath it was the version of Stephen Cool I'd always known was there. You're going to cost her everything, too, he said. You understand that? You think this only hits me? She's on that restaurant title. I know she is, I said. Something moved behind his eyes. He hadn't expected that. He'd come here thinking I hadn't read Crawford's report carefully enough, or that the detail about Harbor Table would land like a threat and make me back down. Then you understand, he said, that you need to stop. I looked at him across the kitchen table. This man who had answered a phone on Thanksgiving and laughed, who had used my signature to borrow $78,000 without telling me, who had built a hidden warehouse under a shell company and prepared a personal exit route while putting my daughter's name on an asset structured specifically to be out of reach, when creditors came calling. Stephen, I said, I want to ask you something. The Grove Grill's point-of-sale records, the cash deposits, 14 months of them. I paused. Does your attorney know about the $23,400 discrepancy? The color didn't leave his face all at once. It went the way color goes in a room when a cloud passes over the sun, gradually, then completely. His hands on the table stopped moving. His mouth opened, and for the first time since I'd known him, Stephen Cool had absolutely nothing to say. I let the silence sit. Then I said, I think you should go talk to Holloway. He stood up. He straightened his blazer, a reflex, the muscle memory of a man who has always controlled the room by controlling how he looks in it. But his face was still the color of old concrete, and his hands were not steady, and the careful posture was now just something his body was doing without him. He left without another word. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after his car pulled out of the driveway. I thought about Crawford's report, sitting in the filing cabinet. I thought about Gordo's audit, clean and documented. I thought about the $23,400. And then my phone buzzed. A message from Crawford. 2 sentences. SC just registered a new LLC. Harbor Bridge Ventures, LLC, filed 6 days ago. Sole member is a Thomas Ray, no known prior relationship to Cole. He was still trying to move pieces off the board. I forwarded the message to Price with a single line. He's not done. Crawford's message about Harbor Bridge Ventures, LLC, sat in my phone for about 20 minutes before I called Price. Thomas Ray, I said, single member, New LLC, filed 6 days ago. Crawford send documentation. The Secretary of State filing. Standard single-member structure. No listed business purpose. Price was quiet for a moment, the quiet of someone running calculations. "This is a fraudulent transfer setup," he said. "He's going to try to move the North Charleston warehouse into this new entity. The LI's pendants blocks the current sale, but if he transfers ownership rather than sells it..." "The Ellis pendants covers both," I said. "Any transfer, any form." "Yes, but filing a fraudulent transfer claim requires us to show intent to hinder creditors. The new LLC, created after the legal dispute began, and with no apparent business purpose, that's strong circumstantial evidence." Another pause. "I can have a complaint drafted by end of week. We file in Charleston County Circuit Court, cite the Uniform Fraudulent Transfer Act, request injunctive relief to freeze any movement of the asset pending outcome." "Do it," I said. "And Price, does Ray have any connection to coal that we should know about before we file?" "I'll have Crawford look at it tonight." Crawford had an answer by the following morning. Thomas Ray was 31, worked in commercial property management, and had, as of 8 months ago, been leasing office space through a property management company that Stephen Cool used as a vendor. Not a close friend, not family. A thin connection. Thin enough that Stephen probably thought it would be invisible. The kind of connection you use when you don't want anyone to find it. They always think that. We filed the fraudulent transfer complaint on a Thursday. Price had structured it cleanly. The sequence of events, the timeline of the LLC formation relative to the legal dispute, the prior Les pendants, the Crawford documentation of Ray's connection to Cool. The court granted a temporary restraining order on the warehouse the same day. No transfer, no encumbrance, no movement of any kind pending the hearing. 2 days later, Palmetto First Bank sent their formal demand letter directly to Stephen Cool's attorney. Price forwarded me a copy. I read it at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee. The bank's language was measured and absolute. The guarantee agreement had been materially modified without the consent of the guarantor, in violation of the agreement's explicit terms. Palmetto First was exercising its right to accelerate the loan. Stephen Cool had 60 days to either produce a new qualified guarantor or pay the outstanding principal balance in full. Outstanding balance, $287,000. I set the letter down and looked at it for a moment. 60 days. Stephen did not have $287,000. He did not have a qualified guarantor. I had already spoken with Price about what qualified meant in Palmetto First's terms, and Stephen's existing financial profile, with its debt load and audit findings, would not come close. And the Grove Grill, which had been running at a $15,000 monthly deficit, was not generating cash. The bridge loan on the warehouse was already past its maturity date, and the private lender had sent its own demand letter 2 weeks prior. He was surrounded on every side by debts with deadlines. The following week, I drove past Harbor Table on East Bay Street. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just happened to be coming back from the hardware store on Meeting Street and took the long way. The restaurant's lights were on. A weekday lunch service, moderate. Through the window, I could see the table set, a few parties eating. The sign above the door, the good one Stephen had paid a designer to make, was still lit. I thought about the first time I'd eaten there, the opening week 3 years ago when Stephen had played host with that whole room warmth of his. He'd been good at it. Whatever else was true, the man knew how to make a restaurant feel alive. I thought about the fact that the title to that building was in my daughter's name. I drove home. The phone rang a little past 10 that night. "Christina," I answered on the second ring. "I got a letter," she said. Her voice was flat in the way that voices go flat when the emotion underneath them is too large and too varied to let out all at once. "From Palmetto First. They're saying Harbor Table is that it falls under collateral claims, that they have a right to pursue it." "I know," I said. "You knew they'd come after me?" "I knew it was a possibility once I understood how Stephen had structured things. The transfer to your name 2 years ago. That's why I started looking at this more carefully." A long pause. "Why didn't you tell me?" It was a fair question. I thought about how to answer it honestly. "Because the night I figured it out, You'd just been in my kitchen telling me I was destroying your family, I said, and I needed to understand the full picture before I said something I couldn't take back. She didn't say anything. Christina, I said, I need you to listen to me. Not to Stephen's version, not to whatever Holloway has told him to tell you, just to what I'm going to say right now. A pause. Go ahead. Your name is on Harbor Table because Stephen put it there as a financial buffer. If his debts caught up with him, your name on the title was designed to complicate the creditor's path. You were being used as a shield, and you didn't know it. I stopped. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because you need to know it before you can decide what to do next. The line was quiet for a long time, long enough that I checked to make sure the call was still connected. Come here tomorrow morning, I said, alone. She came. She arrived at 8:30. I had coffee made and the full Gordo audit report printed and sitting on the kitchen table, not as an ambush, but because there was no gentle version of what was in it, and I had learned, in a long career of delivering unwelcome numbers to people, that cushioning the delivery rarely helps anyone. I said, sit down, read this. I'm not going to comment while you do. She sat. She read. It took about 20 minutes. I stood at the counter and looked out the window at the backyard. The winterberry holly had taken hold, small red clusters starting to show against the brown of the yard. When she finished, she put the report down on the table. She didn't cry. She sat very still the way people sometimes do when the thing they've been half afraid of for a long time turns out to be real. Did you know? She asked. I suspected, I said, for longer than I'd like to admit. But suspicions aren't documents. The $23,400? That's from the Grove Grill. Over 8 months. The auditor can't say definitively where it went without access to Stephen's personal accounts, but the POS records are clear. She looked at the table. Something was moving behind her eyes. Not anger yet, not grief, something harder to name, the look of a person recalculating. He was going to let the bank come after Harbor Table, she said, not a question. That's what the structure suggests, yes. If he'd managed to move the warehouse before I blocked the sale, he'd have had $185,000 in a clean account. The restaurants would have folded. The bank would have pursued whatever collateral they could reach, and Harbor Table, technically yours, would have been the first asset in line. You'd have been the one negotiating with their attorneys, not him. She was quiet for a long time. I have a referral, I said, an attorney who handles asset protection. Not a friend of mine, someone I found through the bar directory, same way I found Price. Someone who represents your interests, not mine, not Stephen's. You already looked. I looked, I said. You don't have to use her, but you should talk to someone before Stephen's legal situation develops any further. What I did not say, because it was not the moment, was that the situation was about to develop considerably further. Price had called me the previous evening with news. Palmetto First's legal team, after reviewing the audit findings and the Gordo report that I'd shared with them through proper channels, had formally recommended accelerating not just the main loan, but also initiating a review of the additional $78,000 credit line for potential fraudulent inducement. The bank's exposure was real, and their lawyers were no longer inclined to be patient. Christina left at 10:15. She took the attorney's name I'd written on a notepad. She didn't say much on her way out, just stood at the door for a moment and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her in 9 years. Not hostility, not the practiced neutrality she'd been wearing since the marriage calcified around her. Something older than that. Stephen's counter-move came 3 days later, technically narrow and not entirely wrong. Holloway filed a motion arguing that the Harbor Bridge Ventures LLC transaction didn't constitute a fraudulent transfer because no transfer had yet occurred. The LLC existed, but no asset had moved into it. Therefore, he argued, nothing to enjoin, no harm suffered, restraining order should go. Price called to walk me through it. He's right that no transfer has occurred. The question is whether the LLC formation itself, given the timing, shows intent to hinder creditors. Under South Carolina's Uniform Voidable Transactions Act, we can argue that, but Holloway will push back, and the judge may want more concrete evidence. What do we need? Evidence that Ray was acting as Cole's nominee. something that shows Harbor Bridge Ventures is just Stephen Cole, with a different name on the paperwork. Give me 2 days, Crawford called back the following afternoon. He'd found a wire transfer. $5,000 from Stephen Cole's personal account to Thomas Ray's, made the same week the LLC was formed. Memo line, consulting services. There was no consulting agreement. Ray was employed full-time at his regular firm with no side practice on record. Crawford confirmed it with a single call to Ray's employer. $5,000 to a man Stephen barely knew, timed precisely to the LLC formation. I forwarded it to Price within the hour. That's what we needed, he said. He filed it the next morning. The restraining order was extended. Holloway, per Price's account of a brief and tense call between them, had gone quiet. That evening I drove out to the Edisto River. I hadn't fished since before Thanksgiving, nearly 3 weeks, and I wanted to stand somewhere that had nothing to do with documents or phone calls or the careful grinding machinery of legal proceedings. I stood on the bank for an hour with a line in the water and caught nothing, which was fine. The catching was never really the point. On the drive back, my phone buzzed with a message from Price. One line, Holloway called at 5 p.m. His client wants to discuss settlement terms. I read it sitting in the truck in my own driveway, the engine still running. I thought about everything that had happened in the weeks since a phone rang on Thanksgiving evening, and a man's voice told me, with practiced casualness, that dinner had already ended and I hadn't been invited. I thought, not yet, Stephen. Not quite yet. I went inside and started making dinner. Holloway's call about settlement terms had been a signal, not an offer. What it actually meant was that Stephen Cole's attorney had looked at the board, the fraudulent transfer complaint, the Palmetto First acceleration demand, the Gordo audit findings sitting in court filings, the Raywire transfer evidence, and had advised his client, as any competent attorney would, that continuing to fight was going to cost significantly more than it would yield. But Stephen being Stephen, he wasn't ready to simply surrender. He was going to try to trade. Price and Holloway exchanged 3 rounds of written correspondence over the following 2 weeks. I read each exchange the day it arrived. The pattern was consistent. Holloway would propose terms that left Stephen with more than he deserved. Price would respond with a clear-eyed accounting of what the documented record actually supported. Holloway would come back slightly less aggressive. The negotiation had the rhythm of a man walking backward toward a wall, taking one step at a time, hoping something would change before he ran out of room. Nothing changed. Then came the court hearing on the counterclaim. Holloway had filed it in Charleston County Circuit Court 6 weeks earlier. Intentional interference with business relations, $500,000 in compensatory damages. Price had been preparing the response for that same 6 weeks. I drove to the courthouse on Meeting Street on the day of the hearing and sat in the gallery. Courtrooms are less theatrical than people imagine. What I watched that morning was a conversation between 2 attorneys and a judge about what a written clause in a contract actually required. The clause was paragraph 11, sub B. Price had built the entire response around it. Stephen Cole had modified the loan terms, a $78,000 additional credit line, without the written acknowledgement the guarantee explicitly required. That modification triggered the voidability provision. My revocation was a guarantor exercising a right activated by the borrower's own breach, not tortious interference. Contract compliance. He cited the clause. He cited the bank's documentation. He cited the timeline. Holloway argued the modification was routine. The guarantee remained binding in spirit. My revocation was personal animus. The judge asked 3 questions, all of them directed at Holloway, all about paragraph 11, sub B. There was only so much Careful could do when the document said what it said. The counterclaim was dismissed. Not reduced, dismissed. No viable legal basis. Costs assessed to the filing party. Price shook my hand in the corridor, brisk, efficient. Holloway's going to call this afternoon, he said. I know, I said. Let him. He called at 4:15. I was in Price's office when it came through on speaker. The offer on the table. Stephen would transfer the North Charleston warehouse, SC Meridian Holdings, all assets, the full $185,000 valuation, to satisfy a portion of the outstanding obligations. In exchange, I would withdraw the fraudulent transfer complaint and release all claims related to the guarantee modification. Holloway read the proposed terms in the measured voice of an attorney who has learned not to let negotiation positions show on his face or in his voice. When he finished, Price looked at me. I had one condition. "There's a non-disclosure provision in the draft," Price said. Section 9. His client is asking Raymond Foster to agree not to disclose any aspect of these proceedings or the underlying findings to any third party. A pause on Holloway's end. "My client's position on that provision," Price continued, "is that it does not appear in the agreement." Another pause. "Mr. Price, a mutual non-disclosure is standard in settlements of this kind." "Raymond Foster did not initiate this dispute," Price said. "He responded to a contract breach. He's not asking for confidentiality. He's not requiring his son-in-law to stay quiet. He's simply not agreeing to be silenced about facts that are documented in public court filings." A longer pause. "I'll need to discuss that with my client," Holloway said. "Of course," Price said. "We'll expect the revised draft tomorrow." The revised draft arrived the following morning with Section 9 removed entirely. Palmetto First Bank did not wait for the settlement to close before moving on their own position. They had been building their case quietly for weeks, and the court dismissal of Stevens' counterclaim had removed the last procedural reason for patience. Within 3 days of the ruling, the bank filed a formal demand for the accelerated loan balance, $287,000, and simultaneously initiated foreclosure proceedings on the Grove Grill, which had remained in Stevens' name and which was listed as secondary collateral on the original loan agreement. That same week, the private lender holding the bridge loan on the North Charleston warehouse sent their own demand. Stevens' 60-day window had long since closed. They were exercising their right to collect. The walls were not closing in anymore. They had already closed. I heard about it through Price, who heard it through Holloway in the course of a brief and, by Price's account, subdued phone call. Stevens' personal attorney had apparently advised him at some point during this process that contesting multiple simultaneous creditor actions while facing a dismissed counterclaim and an active fraudulent transfer complaint was not a survivable financial position. Holloway confirmed that his client was prepared to sign. The settlement paperwork was finalized in Price's office on a Tuesday morning. I did not attend the signing. I was in the garage that morning, sanding the rocker joints on the chair I'd been building since Thanksgiving. The chair had become something of an unintentional chronicle of the whole business. I'd started the legs the night of the phone call, finished the seat during the first week, built the back slats while waiting for Crawford's reports, shaped the armrests in the days after the court hearing. Now it was nearly done. I was working on the rockers, which require a particular patience because the curve has to be consistent, or the chair will drift when someone sits in it. My phone was face up on the workbench. At 10:47 it buzzed. A text from Price. Signed and notarized, both parties. All provisions executed. I set down the sandpaper and read it again. Then I put the phone back on the workbench, picked up the sandpaper, and kept working. Here is what the settlement accomplished. Stephen transferred SC Meridian Holdings and its $185,000 warehouse to a creditor trust. The fraudulent transfer complaint was withdrawn. The Elias pendants released. As part of the negotiated terms, he also signed a deed release, removing all encumbrances from Harbor Table. The restaurant at 112 East Bay Street, already in Christina's name, was now clean. No cross-collateral claims, no bank notices. Hers outright, free and clear. Section 9, the non-disclosure provision, was not in the signed document. 3 days after the settlement closed, Palmetto First completed foreclosure on the Grove Grill. The distressed sale proceeds reduced Stevens' personal deficiency to approximately $139,000. Add the private lender's bridge loan claim. Add months of attorney fees on a fight he'd lost at every turn. Add the operating losses. The number Price mentioned, quietly, a few weeks later, $329,000 in personal liabilities, with no remaining business assets. Holloway filed the Chapter 7 petition on a Thursday morning. Stephen Cool, who had once told me that dinner had already ended and I hadn't been invited, was officially bankrupt. Christina called me 4 days after the settlement signed. She said she wanted to come by. I said she was welcome any time. She arrived on a Saturday afternoon. I was finishing the rocker chair. The last coat of oil, worked into the grain by hand. She came into the garage and sat on a stool near the workbench and watched me without saying anything. The old Christina would have filled the silence immediately. This version let it be. "Why did you make sure Harbor Table was in the settlement?" she said after a while. "Because it was already in your name. The settlement just made it clean. You could have let the bank take it. I could have." She was quiet. I could feel her thinking. "You knew what he'd built," she said. "The warehouse, the firewall, all of it." I suspected. I needed the documentation before I could act. "And the whole time I was telling you that you were the problem?" I set down the cloth. She looked older than she had at Thanksgiving, not in the way that comes from damage, but in the way that comes from clarity. "You weren't told the truth," I said. "That's not the same as being the problem." She looked at the chair. "Is that what you're building it for? To give away?" "Probably. I usually give them away." She almost smiled. She stayed another hour. We talked about the restaurant, its finances, the staff. The most practical conversation we'd had in years, and the most honest. When she left, she paused at the garage door. "I'm sorry," she said, "for what I said when I came here the first time." "You said what you believed then." "That's what I'm sorry about." She drove away. I went back to the chair. A few days later, I drove out to the Edisto River at first light with a rod and a thermos of coffee. The water was moving the way it moves in late winter, dark, unhurried, carrying things you couldn't see. I caught 2 bass and released both. Neither was large enough to keep, and I hadn't come to keep anything. On the drive home, I passed East Bay Street. Harbor Table's sign was lit. A weekend brunch service, prep crew already inside. Through the window I could see the kitchen lights, someone moving near the counter. A regular morning. I drove home, put the rod away, and stood in the garage looking at the finished chair. The rockers ran true. The joints were tight. The grain had come up well under the oil. It would last a long time. I thought about the phone call on Thanksgiving, the casual contempt in that voice, the laughter, the sound of my daughter not speaking, all the documents that had followed, the filings, the certified letters, the quiet machinery of it turning steadily in one direction. I thought, that's done. I made coffee and carried it out to the front porch and sat in the old chair, not the new one, not yet, and watched the morning come up over Magnolia Creek Drive. The winterberry holly had gone fully red now, bright against the winter graveyard. It had settled in well. It would be there a long time. I drank the coffee and listened to the street wake up. The weight of the thing was genuinely gone. Not just the anger, which had been gone for a while, but something heavier. The weight of holding a structure together that someone else had been quietly taking apart from the inside. I had put it down. Whatever came next was someone else's to carry. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.